Imagine this. For more than 30 years in the 15th century, England just tore itself apart. This wasn't a war against some foreign invader. No, this was a brutal, bloody family feud. It was a civil war between two rival branches of the same royal family, the House of York with its white rose and the House of Lancaster with its red rose. And they were all fighting for the ultimate prize, the crown of England.
You know, this quote right here, it absolutely nails the sheer chaos of the time. This was not some clean strategic war. Forget that. This was a messy, personal, brutal slugfest where the most powerful nobles in England were literally, as it says, crashing around in the mud, trying to rip the crown off the king's head. So how on earth did it all go so wrong? Well, it really starts with a tale of two very different kings. On one side, you have the legend, Henry V, a military genius, the guy who conquered France. And then you have his son, Henry VI. Now, Henry was a good, pious man, but as a king, he was weak, prone to complete mental breakdowns, and just totally ineffective. It created what one historian perfectly called a complete emptiness at the center of power. And that kind of vacuum is incredibly dangerous.
Right, that emptiness created a power vacuum. And in medieval England, a vacuum is never empty for long. It gets filled with ambition, with plotting, and eventually with bloodshed. So let's dig in and trace the roots of this 30-year conflict. Okay, the whole messy business goes all the way back to one man, King Edward III. The problem was he had a lot of sons. Now, here's the crucial part. The king on the throne, the Lancastrian Henry VI, was descended from Edward's third son. But the Yorkists, they could trace their claim back to the second and fourth sons. And their argument was basically just simple math. Second beats third. They truly believed they had a stronger, more direct claim to the throne. And here was the real kicker for the Yorkists. They argued that the entire Lancastrian dynasty was built on an illegal act. See, back in 1399, Henry IV had stolen, or usurped, the throne from the rightful king, Richard II. For the Yorkists, this was the original sin. It made every Lancastrian king that followed, including Henry VI, illegitimate. And look, this wasn't just some dusty old family argument. By the 1450s, the entire kingdom was falling apart. All those amazing victories in France were gone, replaced by humiliating defeats. The government was totally broke, law and order had broken down, and people were fed up. England was basically a powder keg, just waiting for a spark. This quote just says it all, doesn't it? And what's so telling is that this isn't from some powerful duke. This is from a popular uprising, a rebellion. Even the common people on the street could see the government was a disaster, that France was lost, and that the king himself was so broke he couldn't even pay for his own food. They were demanding change. And that desperate call for change, well, it found a champion. This is the moment the political crisis becomes a deeply personal, violent rivalry between two huge personalities who are about to collide. So on one side, you've got Richard, Duke of York. He's got that stronger claim to the throne we talked about, he's popular with the people, and he is very ambitious. And on the other side, the absolute force of nature that was Queen Margaret of Anjou. With her husband often in a catatonic state, she was the one really running the country. And she was fiercely protective of her son's right to be the next king. She looked at York and didn't just see a political rival. She saw a threat to her family's very existence. Then, in 1455, the War of Words finally turned into a war of swords. At a town called St. Albans, what started as a political argument in the street just exploded into a full-on battle. And when York's men killed the Duke of Somerset, who was the Queen's closest and most powerful ally, that was it. There was no turning back. The first blood had been spilled. And as the Lancastrians got the upper hand for a time, they unleashed this terrifying political weapon, the Bill of Attainder. Honestly, this was worse than just being executed. This was complete and total erasure. It declared you a traitor, stripped your family of every title, every acre of land, and disinherited your children forever. Suddenly, for the Yorkists, this wasn't about winning the crown anymore. It was about sheer survival. The brutality just kept escalating. At the Battle of Wakefield, Richard, Duke of York, was killed. But Queen Margaret didn't just stop there. In a moment of supreme, vicious mockery, she had his head cut off and stuck on the gates of the city of York, with a paper crown jammed on it. She had finally gotten rid of her great rival. But in doing so, she created a new one who was now hell-bent on revenge, his son, Edward. And Edward was not alone. He had the backing of one of the richest, most powerful men in the entire kingdom, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, a man who would go down in history by a single incredible nickname, the Kingmaker.
Together, Edward and Warwick were just an unstoppable force. The young Edward turned out to be a brilliant general, and at the Battle of Towton, fought in the middle of a blinding snowstorm, he won an absolutely crushing victory. It was one of the bloodiest battles ever fought in England. He was crowned King Edward IV, and for all intents and purposes, it looked like the war was over. The Yorkists had won.
But then, King Edward made a catastrophic mistake. While the Kingmaker, Warwick, was over in France trying to negotiate a politically brilliant marriage for him with a French princess, Edward went behind his back and secretly married an English commoner, Elizabeth Woodville, for love. He had just publicly humiliated the richest, most powerful, and most dangerous man in his kingdom. Not smart. And Warwick's revenge was just spectacular. I mean, think about the sheer audacity of this move. He does a complete 180 and makes an alliance with his most hated enemy, the former Queen Margaret of Anjou. Together, they invade England, they force King Edward to flee into exile, and they put the old, feeble Henry VI back on the throne. The Kingmaker lived up to his name. The man who made a king had now unmade him. This incredible reversal kicks off the most ruthless phase of the entire war. This is the final, bloody act where everything is on the line, and the crown is going to be won and lost through betrayal and pure brutal force. But you should never, ever count Edward IV out. He was a born warrior. He returns from exile and launches this lightning-fast, brilliant, and utterly ruthless campaign. First, he confronts the Kingmaker himself at the Battle of Barnet and kills him. Then, just a few weeks later at Tewkesbury, he completely destroys the last Lancastrian army and kills their heir to the throne on the battlefield. In just a matter of months, Edward had taken it all back. So, with the Lancastrian heir dead, there was only one loose end to tie up. A few days later, poor old Henry VI was quietly murdered in the Tower of London. The direct Lancastrian line was now extinct. Edward IV was secure on his throne, and England, finally, got more than a decade of peace. But that peace shattered when Edward died suddenly in 1483. He left his 12-year-old son, Edward V, as the new king. Now, a child on the throne was always a recipe for trouble. So Edward's loyal and very ambitious brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named Lord Protector to rule the kingdom until the boy was old enough. What happened next has become one of the darkest and most enduring mysteries in all of history. Richard took his two young nephews, the new king and his little brother, to the Tower of London, supposedly for their own safety and protection. Then he had them declared illegitimate. He seized the throne for himself as Richard III, and the two little princes were never, ever seen again. Richard's ruthless power grab was just a step too far for many people. It horrified the nobility, and it united all of his enemies. And they started to rally around a very unlikely challenger, a man in exile with a pretty thin claim to the throne, Henry Tudor. So it all comes down to this: one final battle at Bosworth Field in 1485. Now, if you just look at the numbers, you'd put your money on Richard. He clearly has the bigger army. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. The real wild card was the powerful Stanley family. They brought 4,000 of their own men to the battlefield, but then they just stood on the sidelines, refusing to commit to either side. Everybody knew the battle, and the crown itself, would be decided by them. Richard, seeing Henry Tudor's banner just across the field, decides to risk it all. He leads this desperate, unbelievably brave cavalry charge straight at Henry, trying to end the battle right then and there. And he almost makes it. But at the last possible second, the Stanleys finally made their choice. They charged in against Richard. The king was surrounded, dragged from his horse, and hacked to death. The victor, Henry Tudor, was crowned King Henry VII right there on the battlefield. And then he made a move of pure political genius. He married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of the Yorkist king Edward IV. This marriage finally united the two warring houses. He literally merged the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York into the brand new Tudor rose. So the Wars of the Roses were finally over. A new dynasty, the Tudors, was born. But think about how they got there. This peace was built on a foundation of rebellion, betrayal, and murder. The violent path to the throne had been normalized, and it set a very dangerous precedent for the century that was to come. You could say the war was over, but the Game of Thrones, that was really just getting started.